Okay, so if you're following along with me, we're on chapter 11. Chapter 11. Stacy opened her eyes and then quickly closed them. That can't be right. Everything was orange. She opened them again and looked around in disbelief. It was as if the train they were on had transformed into a space shuttle during the night and flown them to another planet. Stacy scanned the horizon for any trace of the familiar taiga, but they'd long left it behind. Everything around them, every rock, hill, and mountain, was a rusty shade of orange. And the sky! Juxtaposed against the coppery mountains, the sky was the most brilliant shade of blue Stacy had ever seen. A mesa biome, Stacy whispered in wonder, sitting up. All of the wolves and Paige were already awake. Stacy opened the flap of her satchel, half expecting Velo to have flown back to the taiga during the night. Much to Stacy's surprise, the bat was still there. He opened one eye to the harsh mesa light and burrowed deeper inside. Stacy gave him a loving pat on the head and took out her binoculars so she could get a better view of the scenery. Looking around, Stacy didn't know what to take in first. There were the large plateaus to the west of her, the tops of which were flat as tables. Farther south is a cluster of tall, spindly rock formations Stacy knew were called hoodoos. And, connecting everything, stretching out as far as her eye could see, was nothing but vast red sand and clay, punctuated by the occasional cactus and sagebrush. We should jump off here even though you stick out like sore thumbs in this biome, Stacy said, looking at the white wolves and then over to her reddish dog. You certainly blend in, Paige, but look around. There's no one here to see any of you. There's no one here at all. They waited until the train was passing a particularly cactus-free patch of the desert and then leaped into a soft red sand dune. Stacy looked around to make sure everyone was accounted for. They were all fine except for Wink, who had managed to land on the one cactus in sight. "Oh, Wink," Stacy said, hurrying over to help him pick the needles out of his rear. Wink whined miserably. After helping him pluck out most of the needles, Stacy and the group set off into the mesa. Stacy couldn't believe how beautiful the mesa biome was. Everywhere she looked, she noticed something different, from the sprawling, prickly pear cacti with hummingbirds flitting around them to the old Joshua trees with their spiky green leaves pointing skyward. And the wildlife! Black-tailed jackrabbits raced from sagebrush to sagebrush, while tiny baby quails scurried after their parents and massive golden eagles soared overhead. "Noah, I don't think this biome suits you," Stacy teased as a sullen-looking Noah walked alongside her with his head down. "I haven't seen a single water source." As soon as the words left Stacy's lips, she realized this was a much bigger issue than she had initially thought. Look how beautiful this is. What she had meant to be a silly joke to Noah was actually a very real threat. Where are we going to find water? Stacy's wolves drank quite a bit of water each day, and the canteens she had brought from the taiga were nearly empty. As soon as she thought about it, Stacy began to feel thirsty. "All right, everyone," Stacy said. "Here's the plan. We're looking for somewhere we can set camp for a couple months, but it needs to have a water source." Stacy reached into her satchel and pulled out a groggy Milo. She gently tossed him into the air, and he started happily flutter about, looking like he was glad to stretch his wings at last. "Milo here can keep us aware of any mesa animals that might be in need of our rescue services," Stacy said. Basil scrambled up some jagged rocks and looked around, her head held high as she tried to spot something new in the unfamiliar landscape. "Anything, girl?" Stacy asked. Basil nodded, so Stacy and the others made their way up the rocks as well, until they could see what Basil was looking at. In the distance, probably about a mile from where they were standing, was a tiny village made up of 2 rows of dilapidated wooden buildings that looked like they hadn't been lived in for years. "I know what that is," Stacy said, jumping off the rock pile and heading toward the village. "That's a ghost town." That was a short chapter, so I'm going to keep reading. Chapter 12. The deserted town seemed strangely silent, quieter somehow than the rest of the mesa around it. Several of the ramshackle wooden buildings had lost their windows, and red sand had blown across the floors, piling into little dunes in the corner. There was what looked like an old abandoned church on one end of the row of buildings, and a blacksmith on the other, its sign weather-beaten but still legible. A wooden water tower loomed over the rest of the town, leaning to one side as if it might fall at any moment. One building looked like it might have been a saloon, another an old bank. Stacy pressed her face against a dirty window that still remained in one of the buildings and saw rows of old-fashioned desks inside. Must have been a schoolhouse. She was tempted to go inside, although it looked completely bare except for the desks. Maybe there was an old book stash somewhere. But when she looked at her wolves, she lost interest in exploring. They were all panting. Wink flopped down in the shade of the schoolhouse looking hot and miserable. She had to find them water. Soon. You don't suppose, Stacy said, reaching into Noah's pack and pulling out a canteen while looking up at the rickety water tower. Noah eagerly ran over to the rusty pump that fed into a barrel at its base and pumped it several times. The pump hissed and sizzled and then spurted out a short blast of brown water before weakening to just a drip. Well, it was worth a try, Noah, Stacy said, screwing the cap back on her canteen. Let's go, everyone. Stacy and the pack continued walking west from the ghost town through the desert, following the setting sun. Wow, Stacy said, looking at the horizon. I think sunsets in the mesa are one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. They wandered a bit longer. Stacy noticed everyone was yawning, herself included. She knew her wolves needed some type of liquid. Suddenly, she had an idea of how to get them rehydrated. Let's set up temporary camp for the night before it gets too much darker, she said to the group. Here is just as good a place as any. The wolves circled back to where Stacy was standing and began prepping for the long night ahead of them. Basil and Noah started collecting rocks and positioning them in a circle so Stacy could build a fire. Everest was sniffing the area thoroughly, always on the lookout for potential danger. Tucker curled up with Paige and Milo and began grooming them, while Wink continued to pick the last of the cactus needles out of his rump with his teeth. Addie, could you give me a hand? Stacy called out to Addison. The amber-eyed wolf came over to where Stacy was standing in front of a towering prickly pear cactus. Here, hold this, please. Stacy hung her leather satchel around Addison's neck with the flap flipped open. Next, she took her hunting knife and began chopping the purple fruit off the top of the cactus cladodes. Once there were 20 or so of the fruit on the ground, Stacy carefully used her knife to spear them. Then she used a stick to knock them from the tip of her knife into the satchel Addison was holding. When the satchel was full of fruit, Stacy and Addison went over to the circle of stones where Basil and Noah had placed a pile of kindling. Examining the wood more closely, Stacy saw that the wolves had gathered dried sagebrush branches. Those will probably smell good when they burn, she thought. There was even a small heap of additional branches outside the stone circle, so that they could keep the fire burning for as long as they needed. Taking out the flint and steel Basil had given her, Stacy rested the end of the C-shaped steel near the pile of kindling and scraped it quickly with the flint. There was no spark. Stacy tried again and again. This should be easier for me than for Basil, she thought, frustrated. I have hands, after all. Basil nudged the flint with her nose, changing the angle slightly, then nodded to Stacy. Gritting her teeth, Stacy tried again. This time, a bright spark flew off the flint and onto the kindling. Dropping onto her belly, Stacy blew gently on the spark, coaxing it into a flame. Basil panted approvingly. Once the fire was burning brightly, Stacy turned to Addison and took the satchel from her, pouring the prickly pears out onto the ground. Careful, she told the wolves, who were looking at them curiously. Those thorns are sharp. The egg-shaped purple fruits were covered with dozens of tiny hair-like thorns. She had to be careful not to touch the skin of the pear, or the thorns would embed themselves into her hands. Stacy grabbed a pointy sage branch from the pile and speared one of the pears with it. She held it over the fire until the thorns had been singed off. After letting it cool, she picked up her old hunting knife and cut into the fruit, making a deep slit in its skin. Inside, she could see the dark purple fruit studded with tiny seeds. Stacy chopped it into several pieces. Try this, she said to Addison and Basil. The female wolves nosed the fruit warily. They had gotten used to eating pumpkin and sometimes apples or berries. A prickly pear was far from an Arctic wolf's natural diet. Stacy picked up a piece of the pulpy fruit and popped it into her own mouth. Oh, she gasped into delight. The watery juice flooded her dry mouth, beginning to quench her thirst. It's as good as a drink, she explained. Basil and Addison encouraged. Each took a bite. Stacy peeled pears until she, Paige, and the wolves weren't thirsty anymore. They also shared a couple loaves of bread and some dried berries, almost the last of what she had brought from their pantry back at the cave. She offered a pear to Milo, but he seemed happy to flap through the air hunting insects. By the time the moon was high in the sky, everyone had had enough to eat. We'll have to find a new food source soon, Stacy thought. The mesa had gotten chillier after the sun set, and she was glad they had the crackling fire to keep them warm. She and Paige and the wolves curled up together as they always did. Tonight, Stacy rested her head on Tucker's back and gazed up the glittering stars. She pulled her necklace from beneath her striped shirt and looked at the charms as they reflected the starlight. My human parents gave these to me, she thought. For a moment, it felt as if they were with her in her pack. Just as Stacy was drifting off to sleep, a loud coyote howl rang out over the mesa.